This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. I don't know about you, but at this time that we are going through, a time of disorientation, a time where we're trying to work out how do we quite fit into all of this? What might the future look like? How long might this be going on for? How can I remain close to people? How can I deal with the separation and isolation? In the middle of all of this, I've been finding that reading our sacred scriptures has had a new kind of resonance. We reflected together before about how the literature of exile coming out of the Old Testament can speak to us really profoundly, speaking honest words of what it means not to feel at home in the world, not to feel at home with God, to be unsure of where we are. When I've been reading the Psalms at morning and evening prayer, the words of the Psalms seem to have taken up a stronger resonance. They feel more edgy because they're all about people and individuals trying to find out who they are as those made in God's image, but those who so often feel far away from God, far away from home. All of our scriptures are written out of this sense of destabilization and difficulty, and yet understand and trust that God is right there at the heart of it all, right there in the thick of it all with us. And perhaps none more so profoundly than our gospel books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So often we're critical, aren't we, of the disciples in the Gospels, because they seem totally bewildered and confused all the time. And we say to them, oh, you stupid people, like Peter, never understanding anything, getting it all wrong. But we must remember, of course, that these first disciples were faced with a reality that they had never faced before. In their mentor and leader, in the face and person and action of Jesus, they were beginning to understand that God was coming to them in a new way, a way that kind of shattered and broke open their world, something that disorientated them and made them think in imaginatively new ways, something that made them think again about who they were called to be, what God was like, and what the world was like as well. And so time and time again in our Gospels, Jesus comes to those disciples in all their frailty, in all their bewilderment, in all their exiles, and he speaks to them with compassionate and kind words. And time again, he says to them, peace be with you. And this, we have a beautiful encounter of this in John's Gospel today that Father Angus has just read out for us. As the disciples and Jesus travel to Jerusalem, they know that they are traveling into impending doom, because this is where Jesus is going to confront the powers of injustice and evil in the world, where he is going to go through his passion and his death, where he's going to be crucified by the violence that lies within men's hearts. And so, of course, the disciples feel bewildered, afraid, dislodged. Their world isn't making any sense to them, perhaps like it isn't for some of us here today. And yet Jesus isn't frustrated with them, isn't angry with them, because he understands that this is a human response. Just as it's a human response in our situation, to feel a bit lost, to feel confused or agitated or anxious or lonely, to not understand what is going to happen in the future. It's perfectly human to feel like that at times like this. And so Jesus says to them, do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. Even as those disciples go through the most difficult of trials, even as they face up to violence, injustice, and loss, Jesus is going to walk with them. And he's going to show them what God is like. Not a God who is distant, not a God who is vengeful, not a God who is violent or judging, but a God who is endlessly forgiving and endlessly loving and endlessly present. And Jesus speaks in that amazing way that we all know, where he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And there are, of course, those in our church who would want to interpret those words in an exclusive and narrow way. Unless you believe like this, unless you have faith like this, unless you can dot all the I's and cross all the T's, you are outside of the mercy and love of God, because Jesus is the only way, the only truth, the only life. But actually, we have to read these words of Jesus in the context in which he speaks them, the context of our gospel stories themselves. And these show that indeed Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But that this isn't a narrow or judging way, but that actually Jesus shows us everything that God is like. He shows us the complete truth of God, a God who utterly gives himself to us in abundant and reckless love, a God who flings wide the gates as he runs towards us to meet us, to scoop us up when we've fallen, to gather us up when we're feeling alone, to enfold us and envelop us with his unending love. This way, this truth, this life is not small, is not narrow, but is actually the way that leads us to God. And this God is a God who is so close to us that he even walks through the places of death, the places of loneliness, the places of exile, and he meets us there. And Jesus, of course, is talking about his death. He's talking about a separation that will open up between him and the disciples. And the disciples are afraid that that separation will mean the end of relationship, the end of hope. But Jesus turns all of this on its head. And he says to them, I am going away to prepare a place for you. And that in my Father's house, there are many, many rooms. Even as Jesus goes to that most hostile and distant place of death, because he carries God's presence and power and purpose with him, death itself is transformed. Transformed from an encounter of fear and anxiety into a place of hospitality and welcome, as God, even in death, makes a space for each of us in order to live and to love. There's no magical escape from the situations that we find ourselves in. Situations that sometimes speak of grief, situations that sometimes speak of loneliness or isolation or anxiety. But what Jesus constantly reminds us is that right here, where we live and as we are, it is right in this place that Christ himself meets us. We are not alone. We're not left with our own resource to cope with things as best we can. But if we open up our hearts and our lives, we will find that God is already with us as Jesus opens up the way, the truth, and the life, and we can live into that abundance and into that depth, wherever we may be.